Okay, welcome everybody. This is our first presentation in our Social Sciences Week series. So just a bit of background for those that don't know that Social Sciences Week, when I joined Charles Sturt University, I think it might have been a fairly new idea. I could be totally wrong about that. But in 2020, I remember us all being in lockdowns and navigating COVID. And I just heard of this idea that people were helping to organize free presentations to share social sciences to a broader audience. And so I jumped on that, and that has only grown. So this year, we have um, people from 20 different countries have registered for these, often to catch up on the recordings. And so it's just a great way to interact and share different ideas. So, and Nevin and I, both being interested in outdoor therapies, uh, are always really excited to present some things. And our presentation today isn't really all that outdoor therapy related, but it is very much akin to our work in the outdoors. So, my name is Will. I come from the US. I've been back and forth from the US and Australia for about 16 years now. And I am a social worker and a social work academic with Charles Sturt University. And Nevin, if you want to introduce yourself really quickly.
Sure, Will. And thank you again, Will, for inviting me back for Social Sciences Week. I think this is time 3 or 4 for me.
Mhm.
I have a couple titles to share. I guess I'm currently the director of our school at the University of Victoria. It's in the School of Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education. It's where I get to teach things like leadership and outdoor recreation. And then I teach counseling still part-time through City University. And I'm also a private practice registered clinical counselor and do outdoor therapies stuff. And yeah,
Mhm.
today's a little bit less. We try hard not to talk about outdoor therapies when we wrote this book, but we did sneak some of it in. So I guess we're staying
Yeah,
in our lane, sort of.
doing our best.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things as we started writing together, Nevin and I were always getting on a call, jumping on a Zoom together, and just looking at current events and what's going on, and how often are we really is as we say that we live in evidence-based times, are we often making evidence-based decisions on things? And so only about 2, 3 weeks ago, it was announced that the state of Illinois was going to legislate mandatory mental health screening for all children from third to 12th grade. So this was about 2.5 million people that will undergo from 2027 a mental health screening. And in the research we were doing while writing together over the last few years, we did take quite a critical swing at some of the measures that are used. So, for example, the most widely used screening tool for depression is the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. This is called the PHQ-9. It is cited in over 11,000 peer-reviewed papers. It's very widely used. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out. It's 9 questions, really robust questions like, are you getting too much sleep or too little sleep? And it's a fascinating measure that has risen and risen in popularity. So one of the issues, if a measure like this, very easy to use, very easy to implement, only takes a few minutes, if that was used in for screening all children, let's say, what we also know about this measure is there is a false positive rate of 65%. So if you took 100 people without depression, 65 of them would look as if they have depression. Another way to think of a false positive rate is sort of like when you burn toast in your toaster and the smoke detector goes off, but the fire department comes every time the smoke detector goes off. So the smoke detector might be working, there might be smoke, but a lot of times there certainly is no fire. So this was a cautionary tale for us. The other thing about the PHQ-9, this comes from a large study in 2011 that 87% of people who were screened using the PHQ-9 left with a prescription for antidepressants. Additionally, 45% of people that tested negative for depression on the PHQ-9 left with a prescription for antidepressants. So we have sort of a counting problem when we hear about youth mental health crises. And certainly some things are really going in the wrong direction. Emergency room visits are going up, and not for kids falling off the monkey bars and breaking an arm, but for self-harm and other concerns. Um, so there are real concerns, but there's also a lot of sensationalism about how we count, and who measures what. Now, the most damning thing about the PHQ-9 is it was created by Pfizer's marketing team when they were rolling out Zoloft. So it was created as a way to open the door for more pharmaceutical treatment for depression. Now, Nevin and I are not anti or pro medication, but we are quite critical, as you'll see through this talk, when we start thinking about power and legislation and who wants there to be a mental health crisis. Additionally, there's a lot of stories about harm that are left off the table. This article is only from Friday in Australia, so the 5th of September in The Guardian, which what this showed was in mining communities, there are still elevated rates of lead poisoning. And there is no safe known concentration. And so one of the interesting is this harm is often kept incredibly quiet. We see at the top post, not to read all this text, but the EPA would quietly load it onto a reporting website with no fanfare or media release. So no information for the general public. And what we're seeing is 76% of Indigenous children in this area, who many would argue would be the most vulnerable, are remain with elevated rates of toxins in their blood. And this was something when we started writing, we probably didn't expect to touch on the environmental health of children. At the same time, we interviewed, Nevin interviewed Dr. Bruce Lamphere, an environmental toxins researcher, who told us a story of lead and then lead poisoning and its relationship to crime. So, Nevin, if you want to just look at this chart, it's pretty
Hmm.
fascinating when we start asking questions of why is youth crime on the rise after 2020, and then where how is legislation and policy actually really helping youth today?
Hmm. Well, this one became really insightful for me, well, too, because in talking to Dr. Lanfear about lead and other toxins that youth are exposed to and the health and behavioral effects that it has upon populations, it also tied into another conversation with Dr. Gordon Neufeld when we were talking about our past in working with youth in the criminal justice system. Because in my own work, I experienced a peak in the 1990s when we had so many kids that were committing crimes and involved in the criminal justice system. And the attribution to lead as a causal agent of all of that behavior was being made clear at that time and has become even more clear since, but I don't think the public necessarily knows about it. Like this slide will, as you're pointing out, is just lead. This is just lead. The relationship between lead and violent crime. Lead was added to gasoline in the 1920s as a known toxin with human health effects. It was known to be a toxin, but corporations insisted upon it. Regulatory bodies allowed it, and we had until the 1970s before there was efforts to get lead out of products. So it's in plastics, it's in paints, it was in fuel and many other things. And it's only just recently we got to a point where it's no longer contributing. But again, to Dr. Lanfear's conversation we had with him, and we explore this quite deeply in the book, is that there's many other toxins.
Hmm.
There's many other causal things that are only now just coming to light in terms of, the history of mercury, the history of the the forever plastics, the PFAFs, and those others that he's talked about. And we also explored the endocrine disruptor herbicide atrazine, which is also being used quite broadly,
Yeah.
um, and how these relate to human health and well-being. We explore in the book, but we also unpack how a lot of the things end up being diagnosed within our realm of mental health, whether it's behavioral issues, whether it's lowered IQ that leads to learning disabilities in the classroom, whether it's lack of attention and those, attention deficit disorder diagnoses that happen in the classrooms. We're not hearing in the mental health space and in the therapeutic space conversations about environmental toxins. And that's the reason why we brought it closer to the front of the book. Um, and we can see it in some of our client work. We can see it in like the concerns around highly processed foods and food dyes, which are getting more attention now, at least in the United States. Um, but underlying this is there's corporate interests. And again, we didn't write a book to try to take down any corporate entities, but we are in these areas pointing out where there are functionaries, people working within all of these systems, within the regulatory bodies, the governments that we believe are supposed to protect us and protect our health, are allowing substances into products that we have contact with every day that can lead to things that we're calling diagnosable or pathological mental health issues. And so
Mm.
that's where we really need to ask those questions. I think people are afraid of speaking out sometimes,
Hmm.
um, but we do need to speak out and speak up when necessary if we're going to protect kids.
Yeah. And so one of the reasons we wanted to chat about this is we kind of hear of what's the most popular thing to kind of scapegoat youth mental health. Today, that's the smartphone, front-facing cameras, social media. And then what's sort of not being talked about? What are we not really addressing? So I know that everybody here has heard these sort of statements that the kids are more fragile. We have a book last year that labeled everybody as anxious. The entire generation is anxious. And what happens is that actually often leads to really quick sort of these sensationalized approaches, sort of like what I discussed with regarding Illinois and mandatory mental health screening. And we see phone-free schools on the rise. A lot of these sound like good ideas. But what Nevin and I thought is they also sometimes really sound like the kids these days effect. Like those damn kids these days, they're so lazy and disrespectful. And so we're not discounting that something is happening here. At the same time, we did kind of find a lot of research to suggest that going down the path of labeling and diagnosing, we've been playing this experiment for about 70 years, and we're only getting worse. In perspective, youth anxiety from 1950, if you took the average child levels of anxiety, self-reported outcomes in the 1950s, by the 1980s, youth were so anxious, their average was the average of people in inpatient hospitalization from the 50s. So it can't just be the smartphone when we see this huge skyrocket also from the 50s. So when we talk about sensationalism and how this sells, I actually saw this on social media over the weekend. And it was a post to say, would John Lennon have written Imagine if he was doom scrolling all the time? And then you see Bob Marley, maybe they've cropped out the marijuana and put in a smartphone. Bob Dylan, Patti Smith. And one of the interesting things is all of these people were considered deviants. You know, the adults of that time looked at the Beatles and thought their pants are too tight, they sing too high pitched, and they were wearing a suit and tie, you know? And so a lot of times we need to zoom out so we're not only living in the times that we're living in, that we can see cautionary tales about this from the past. And one of the fascinating things that I started thinking about, and we were talking about this throughout our writing together, but One of the other ones was pinball in the 40s. Pinball was banned in New York City. Now, of course, pinball looks like a slot machine. It makes jingly sounds. You put money in, and there's a lot of links between pinball and the mob. But look at the language that was used to talk about pinball. In New York City, they rounded up like hundreds of pinball machines and threw them in the river. And it was because of a pinball addict, right? I found a quote from in Milwaukee of a probation officer saying, "I have not met any child that is going through youth court that hasn't played Satan's game," referring to pinball. And so it's a fascinating cautionary tale where are we missing the point here? That if the phones are a problem, and maybe they are, is rounding all of them up and getting them out of the schools, is that the solution? Or is this a symptom of a bigger problem? We have record rates of reported loneliness, social disconnection, and is the phone interfering with that? Sure. But if we get rid of it, now what? Does that mean extra resources for educators or social workers or psychologists to do this work? And so we really wanted to, in with this presentation and with what Nevin and I have been working on over the last 5 or so years, what we wanted to do was say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that gets to the, you know, the front page of the newspaper that looks like, ah, somehow we've got this. And it gets far too narrow. And then what happens is we don't really spend time trying to fix the thing that's the very problem, which is probably much more simple than legislating our way through handling the smartphones. Nevin, why don't you chat for a second just about how we approach this and how we tried to zoom out and zoom into important issues that are off the record, like toxins.
Yeah, it'd be nice to say that we had a plan right from the start and we just logically followed it. And I imagine this is the case with most projects and books, is that we had a sense that there was something that's not working. We were sitting actually, I think, at a conference in Norway talking about how there are more therapists than ever. There's more counselors and social workers and psychologists, and yet these rates of mental health illness were continually climbing, and this notion that there was a crisis within youth. And I think our conversation was directed by the fact that we started talking to people. The first few people that I interviewed gave us a sense of, oh, we should probably look at that too. And then it became that breadcrumb trail of interesting topics, following leads that our experts in the book were giving us, and then digging in and doing the research, right? And getting a sense of what is the evidence on this, and how did we come to include not just the expert's view, but what the research was saying, but then also our own perspectives from our own colleagues, our own experience in doing therapeutic work as educators, as parents of teens and now young adults as well. And I don't think we ever claimed that there isn't a problem, and I don't think we've ever claimed that we have any answers or solutions either. And I think we also experienced with our publisher, or our seeking of publishers, that we kind of went pretty broad on this. And
Mm.
most of the books that are out in this space right now are just based on a single variable. And I think you and I agreed early on that we wanted to avoid that. There is a book about social media and cell phones. There is a book about bad therapy. There is a book about parenting. There is a book about outdoor risky play. Um, and I think we both also have a sense of looking for alternatives to what maybe the mainstream message or a standardized approach is. I know in our conversations, your punk background,
Yeah.
and I've got anarchist tendencies as well. Like, we're not generally quite accepting of what is being said as this is the way it is. And so anything that becomes dogmatic was questioned. And we also fully agree that any standardized approaches where people claim that they have the answers quite likely don't. Universalist interventions tend not to cross over cultures and contexts very well. So we were thinking that as some of these topics, some people are talking about, some people aren't talking about some of the topics. let's put it out there. And I think it's nice that you put some of the quotes up here. And I know to get feedback from, say, someone like Dr. Bruce Perry, who in his emails had said basically, people just have to back off and let kids grow up. Let's get back to letting kids develop by providing them enough safety, enough opportunity, and enough experience for them to figure things out for themselves. That search for identity, the adventure of adolescence is so significantly limited now by adults who have created all the environments that kids are now quote unquote sick in. And we just need to give them more space and room and voice um, to fully develop as into young adults.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And there's also bits, and this I'm going to pass this back to you in 1 second, Nevin. Er, there's also bits of this that was really about being pragmatic, being right down the middle of, because a lot of people, um, when we get, so, I mean, we've seen this in our own professional circles with being advocates for outdoor therapy. It is a slippery slope to thinking outdoors better than everything else, where really what we know is what's better for who is a much more interesting question. So we tried to not take sides on things. Like I said, not anti-medication. If medication helps, fantastic. What we do see is we've given so much of this that we're finding antidepressants in water runoff and in the fish that we eat. We're seeing a record shortage of, synthesized methylphenidate. We're seeing a shortage of stimulants used for ADHD medications. And we wrote this in the book that this is sort of antithetical to any approach to public health, which should be to intervene the least amount with the least amount of people. And what we're seeing is these skyrocketing rates of intervention, which could be interfering with, whatever normal youth development is. But what's interesting, going back to even the days of Eric Erickson, it's, um, the developmental psychologist stages of identity formation for adolescents. Eric Erickson said, when we got kids out of factories, it was because it was stunting their growth and development. And now it's time to not let our own anxieties as adults to keep doing the stunting. That young people, we need them to adventure through their adolescence. And what we found was many mental health interventions get stuck with labeling, and now we're labeling the adolescent experience where it's no longer what somebody is going through, it's I am this, I am that. And so we started going, there's sort of an issue here. But again, we also know there's good, very good research that people can feel a sense of euphoria and relief of getting the right label. But then what do we do after that? Tended to be really important.
Mhm. I would only add here that this notion of being pragmatists and translating that to a book was a pretty good challenge for us both in
Mm,
terms of there was no point in being hyperbolic in one direction or another. You know, there's the potential that we could have been super divisive and maybe even sold far more books, but we know that that tends to miss nuance. And many of these conversations are very nuanced. We continue to come back to the, say, the social media or the banning of cell phones in schools. It's
mm,
hard not to respond to some of the energy that's driving what is in essence a moral panic, um, with just simple questions about, well, what about the young person who needs to be able to check in a couple times a day and text with an older sibling to just feel secure enough, safe enough to attend school? Well, now they're under a cell phone ban, and they may be someone that just doesn't attend school anymore, or someone that has assistive technologies that requires a device. And it's not nuanced enough. It's a blunt instrument to be prohibitionist. And so, as much as we as parents and maybe as educators are like, yeah, we don't need cell phones in schools, and maybe they'll pay more attention, maybe they'll be better off. But what we've done is we've created a school-based intervention that has nothing to do with the time that a child is or a youth is outside of school. So does that put more pressure on the parents for dealing with children that want to spend more time on their devices after school? And is that any different than the introduction of ADHD drugs into the classroom with a morning dose and a midday dose, but not evenings and weekends. That would tended to be the pattern with ADHD, and we know that the majority of those diagnosed with ADHD in classrooms tend to be boys and tend to be the youngest in the classroom.
Yeah.
So again, we're pathologizing and medicating a child experience rather than something that may actually be problematic in terms of behavior.
Absolutely. And one of the things we looked at here, and this is the missing or exhausted middle, is sometimes a political term that neither side represents you, and it's exhausting to be bouncing from extreme to extreme to extreme. There's also missing middle used in Australian context. I'm sure this is used elsewhere in regards to youth mental health, that young people who could benefit from therapeutic care aren't at risk enough, right? So they don't get caught into the system. So both of these ideas, though, when we started sitting down and talking to experts about what's going on with kids these days, that's basically all we asked these people. One of the interesting things is all of them who are experts in their own right. I'm thinking about Dr. Mari Swingle, who wrote a book, I Minds, over 10 years ago about the impacts of media, the iPhone, how this is impacting young people's brains. Mari still took a very nuanced approach. She argued that digital interference, for instance, scrolling on your phone and not getting a good night's sleep, not good. Digital integration, being there's parts of the brain that light up that spark creativity with technology. We see this with people who are building video games. Um, at the same time, I know of therapists doing wonderful work with technology. We have a student right now, a master of social work student, who's worked with narrative therapy ideas and Minecraft, building the tree of life in Minecraft. We're seeing actually with young people diagnosed with autism, we're seeing video games used to help practice and learn social skills as well. So digital integration is possible. But what was interesting is those narratives didn't tend to make it to the top. It was easy scapegoats that were the problem, which is we're pinballing again, which is how Nevin and I really looked at it. While the nuanced boots on the ground view, I would say this is the missing middle, the everyday teacher, adult, sports coach, therapist who is up against changing tides of political ideas, but also changing tides of it was only 20 years ago, everybody had a genetic predisposition to something. And now today, everybody has trauma. And who knows what the next thing will be. And still, what we know is a relational, collaborative approach with young people tends to be um, what works what works best. And one of the um, concerns is and we talked about the at the start, environmental health, the toxins, how that it gets like actively covered up. Sometimes when the companies get in trouble, I think Nevin, you found this that a chemical like atrazine or some of the herbicides and pesticides, when they get in trouble, they put a warning label like on cigarettes on the packaging, but you and I we never see the packaging. So it's still in the water, on our food. It's a wild story. But so at the same time, when we give up power to who we hope is doing the regulating, one of the interesting things is when a parent, I hear this all the time from parents that call me, does my child need a diagnosis to see you? And I remember in the early 2000s running a intensive outpatient program in Maryland where private health insurance would cover our services, but only with a diagnosis. So what we had was parents saying, "I don't want that label on my child's record." And then we'd have to have a discussion like, just put adjustment disorder down. At least that one goes away. So at the same time, we see rises in youth being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder in England. Uh, the Nursing Association, Surgeon Association, all the medical associations have gotten together to say no child should ever be diagnosed with any personality disorder because the stigma that occurs when they go to the emergency room ends up skyrocketing. So the book, in many ways, is sort of a protest for youth that it's like we can actually get through a lot of this in easy, in not easy, but um, we're turning to folks that have a lot of power, and maybe their decisions don't always work. And what's interesting is as we read, as Nevin and I, as experiential educators, we went and read old John Dewey texts. I was really nerding out on old Jane Addams stuff. What's in vogue right now, what feels sort of like the way out, like free range, having a free range childhood. Jane Addams wrote about that on page 9 of 20 Years in Hull House, which is basically one of the first social work texts ever. It's a foundational reading. And what's interesting, that book was written in 1909. And so we sort of had this argument, but it wasn't about phones, or they talked about advanced technology, advanced locomotion, trains. People thought all of this was making kids lazy in the early 1900s. But what's really interesting, they were also arguing against compulsory schooling, which we were only a few
Oh,
a few decades in to that. So it's fascinating in that way. Am I back, Nevin? Did I lose you?
yeah, I'm back.
Ah, okay. Sorry. I didn't say anything important anyway. Who
That's fine.
knows? That's good. So one of the things we thought about is many of our interventions, and this is in psychotherapy research as well. They treat young people as well, all people as you're a passive recipient to the therapist's expertise. You have to take this pill and then life will get better. But we thought how many young people are treated as neglected factors. I know I've interviewed a bunch of young people that say, no one ever asked me what I wanted. And so we used this old Kurt Hahn sort of saying about treating youth as crew, not passengers. And Nevin, do you want to take it away with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an ongoing criticism of much of the work that's happening as we just have more adults talking about kids as opposed to talking with kids. A number of the books that we're not necessarily calling out, but critical of in terms of the tone is the labeling and the pathologizing and mandating these sort of universalist approaches, and at the same time not really integrating the voice and the voices of the youth. And I know one of the things that we noticed as we were putting the book together is that we were finding our older, wiser experts talking about things that sounded far more traditional or old school. Dr. Martin Brokenleg, his indigenous education perspective around young people just needing to feel like they belong, having opportunities to experience mastery. Those collaborative relational approaches are those that allow us to build strength in relationships, build strength in community, build strength within families and within other settings. And it's not interventionalist and it's not pathologizing. It's just simply good, what we would have called good youth work or good family work or good community work. Um, and it's also not seeking cures. I think from our toxins chapter, I mean, we really hit home the fact that there is a lot of money invested into cures, especially problematic when we know causes. Like, what is the point of investing money looking for a particular gene therapy to alter the way that someone responds to, say, a medical issue like cancer when there is particular toxins and environmental things that are causing these that the energy could be put towards to avoid the problem happening in the first place. So if we have issues within classrooms or we have issues within communities, why don't we work with kids as crew to find out what's going on for them and often allow them to, bring forward the resolutions.
Mm.
Kids just need to know that they are needed and that they're not just, riding along. They're not a passenger on this trip. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And what we,
So,
what we, one of the things we started looking at, I mean, we looked at education, we looked at therapy, we looked at labeling, we touched on a lot of different topics. And one of the things when we think about the kids these days effect, it treats them like they're empty vessels. They're waiting, we're outsourcing childhood to experts. And so the experts are the people that can we're waiting on to fill up these empty vessels. But one of the going back to again to the early 1900s, if we took the view of thinking about democracy and experiential learning and participation, one of the arguments was the best classroom should mimic the best democracy, which is everybody participating and viewing democracy as bigger than just ticking a ballot box. And so, one of the things when I hear stories of youth don't have sex anymore, they don't go out drinking, they're too locked up in their home, they're not out in the real world, it makes me think, have we scared them to participate? Is that a problem with the kids? Or is that 24-hour news? Is that social media feeding them an algorithm? Um, are they taking risks? Have we let the risk society get so far that everyone is scared of taking risks and trying other things? So we want to, in our work, really treat youth as not an empty vessel. They do have something to contribute. And when they feel they have something to contribute, usually they'll become a bit more curious about things. So Nevin and I avoided any type of to-do list with this book. We did not find 7 habits, 4 norms, 12 rules, anything that probably leads to a best-selling book. Um, but I did want to share some of the kind of cautionary tales or some of the ideas that we did find here, and then Nevin, you can jump in after that. But we started our project with avoiding any single cause. It's not just phones, it's not just the school, it's not just who's in power, those sort of things. We need to zoom out and embrace that there's a lot of different things that young people are trying to navigate. Additionally, we want to think about how we can lead to balanced exposure in the real world that leads to more mastery, more independence. So, for instance, we have, this idea of stranger danger. We don't want kids walking to school. We don't want them talking to strangers. But at the same time, they have a phone. They bring every stranger into their home. So we want to balance exposure in the real world to face some adversity um, and not adversity in the adverse childhood experiences ways. We want to build some, yes, I can be out there and go do something risky, and I know where the lighthouses are. I know where safety is that I can come back to. Um, and that when we intervene, we want to intervene in a relational and not too intrusive of a way. Similar to the other bullet point, we're thinking about safe enough places. And one theme throughout the book is about how human beings, we love safety and freedom. But sometimes we focus too much on the safety and then not enough on when we have a safe enough place, that's where we can take risks. I feel safe to push the boundaries a little bit. And we see this on younger children's playgrounds all the time. And everybody you'll see this when you go driving today or tomorrow, whenever. You'll drive past a school and all the kids will be playing along the fence because that's where the excitement is, at the edge, at the boundary. And so that can look like not safe risk taking, but they're safe enough, they're within the boundary. And then at the same time, if we read things or see things where we say, that kind of sounds like bullshit, that as adults, we really do want to start calling out for some systemic change. One of the most damning things is since 1977, we have not had 1% improvement in psychotherapy outcomes. Now, this is not for a lack of trying. We had about 60 or so therapies then. Now we have over 1,000. So creating new therapies has not moved the needle on anything. And so we need to start going, why are we creating more and more of the same thing and not looking at why is this not getting better? And I'll pass over to you, Nevin.
Did you want me to add?
Yeah.
I think I froze up, Will.
Turn your camera on and off. I can keep rambling if you want, because it'd be nice to
Maybe
stop.
my internet connection, not sure.
I can hear you, no problem. Oh,
My
you
in
might be back.
Yeah,
Go for it.
apparently my internet is unstable. I'm not sure that was a clinical diagnosis of my internet or
Yes, that's
not,
what I was
but
thinking.
yeah,
Emotionally unstable. Yeah.
yeah. One of our experts is runs a behavioral medicine lab. He does not intervene as a medical practitioner, but rather as a behavioral interventionist. And he is saying that after decades and decades of doing research, this is Dr. Ryan Rhodes, a colleague of mine, that change tends to take place when things are actually just small changes. So one simple change can lead to another. And he had this phrase that we used in the book, and we actually named a chapter after it that like change can be elegant. Like simple interventions can sometimes create change. We have a couple examples in the book. There's one about a client that I worked with, but I was just thinking, I've previously spoken to this on one of our Kids These Days talks, but
Mhm.
we wanted to create a change in the environment in a schoolyard. We wanted to create an environment that kids would more actively do outdoor risky play. The idea was to build some hills within the school grounds to create some change in height, and so kids could experiment with speed and running up and down hills. And we ended up getting limited by the groundskeepers union, who said the hills, everything has to still be mowable by the same devices. So these big lawn tractors that mow, they have to still be able to go back and forth without creating more work for them. What we ended up doing was creating a bit of a bump in the landscape. It was not a huge height of land. It didn't even look like a hill unless you were up close to it. What we found were that the kids were actually starting to run up and down it, and that their levels of moderate and low and moderate vigorous play were increased. The intervention was successful. The intervention was just basically what looks like a flat line. It has a small hump in it. It was a very, very simple, elegant change to the environment that not many people would have actually recognized, but the effects on the children was immense. It was a
Mhm.
very small, simple intervention. And so our book doesn't have, four norms or 12 rules, but as Scott Miller did the book review, Will, with Dan, he pointed out that it's chock full of suggestions for adults. And many of them are just small changes that if someone can hang on to them, they can implement them themselves, but they don't have to then depend on a set of rules or a set of expectations or a set of norms. And I think that's hopefully what we've been able to do, is to provide the reader with lots of opportunity for small changes. And one of my favorite organizations here in Canada is the Canadian Men's Health Foundation. And their tagline is "Don't change much." And they
Mhm.
recognize that when the men that seek help from that organization start small things like maybe less drinking leads to choices about better diet, choices about going to sleep on time, waking up more refreshed. Maybe I'm going to start going to the gym, and that this cascade of change happens through small, simple interventions. And that's where adults do not need to be overwhelmed with what might seem like significant issues. Because, and the other theme we're not talking about today is wicked problems, and that's the fact that just banning cell phones is not going to solve this problem.
Mhm.
Just talking about how therapy might be bad if we spend too much time identifying with problems or as problems. Um, but there's going to be many interventions at many levels by many people, and we might not know if it's truly a wicked problem. We should not know what actually helped resolve the issue, and the issue may never completely go away. So there may always be a kids these days effect. There may always be adults being hyperbolic about a moral panic of this, that, and the next thing, whether it's locomotion, pinball games,
Mhm.
television rotting brains, whatever the issue is. we just need to, as adults, back off and stop making big decisions and big interventions that might have regrettable, consequences. A great example, Will, in the writing of this book was talking about your experience and my experience in classrooms as students in the sort of K to 12 system. Um, I was still in school at a time when my behavior led to going to an office and having a leather strap, smashed across my open palm to get
Mm,
some kind of intended result. Well, in your time in school, they had already turned to medication.
that's right.
Was that the right thing to do? And maybe what's the next? I don't know. So
Yeah,
simple can be elegant.
absolutely. So what we'll do now is if people want to have a chat, that would be awesome. We can stop the recording if people would prefer. Any discussion up to you. Nevin and I, our book is out on the 30th of this month, which is really exciting. If you'd like to join our launch team, we'll have a virtual cheers. It'll be very early in the morning for us at Australia, and then the afternoon for the North Americans, and probably the middle of the night for people in Europe again. But we'd love to have you join the launch team if you'd like. So flick me an email if you're interested in that. That would be fantastic. And then one of the things we also have coming up in November, Nevin is flying over the Pacific and coming and from the 23rd to the 21st to the 23rd of November, we'll be in Port Macquarie, and we have a I'm putting the draft program into the chat box in a second. It's sort of a big file, so it's going to take a second. But we'll have an experiential conference where we're looking at therapeutic work, education, all different types of ideas. And so it'd be awesome to come to that. There's no level of experience or anything necessary. If you have an idea you want to share, just get in touch with me. So with that note, maybe I'll stop sharing, Nevin, and if anyone has questions, thoughts, I can stop the recording and we will go from there.